By the early 2010s, the gaming industry was already in the middle of a massive shift. Digital distribution had taken over. Steam was no longer just a quirky platform from Valve that shipped Half-Life updates. It had become the central hub for PC gaming. Indie developers, who used to rely on publishers or obscure shareware channels, suddenly had a way to reach millions of players directly. But with that opportunity came a problem: funding. Making games isn't cheap. Even small indie projects can rack up years of work and huge costs before they ever see the light of day. Traditional publishers were reluctant to fund risky or experimental ideas. Kickstarter and crowdfunding were exploding in popularity at the time. Remember the Ouya console hype? But that method came with its own issues. Backers gave their money upfront, with no guarantee of what, if anything, they'd ever get in return. Enter Steam's solution: Early Access, officially launched in March 2013. The pitch was simple but powerful. Instead of asking players to fund a dream on Kickstarter with promises, developers could sell a playable build right now. Fans didn't have to wait years to see if a game would materialize. They could jump in instantly, bugs and all, and watch the project evolve in real time. Valve framed it almost like a partnership. Their own press release sold Early Access as a community-driven experiment. Titles in Early Access are still being developed, but are made available for purchase to gamers. This allows players to help shape the final product, provide feedback, and get a unique look at the creative process. It sounded revolutionary. Imagine being there from day one, watching your favorite game grow, suggesting features, maybe even chatting directly with the devs in forums, and seeing your ideas implemented. In an era when AAA publishers were starting to feel increasingly disconnected from their fans, Early Access promised the exact opposite: intimacy, transparency, and collaboration. The timing couldn't have been better. Around 2012 and 2013, the survival genre was exploding. Minecraft had proven that an unfinished, blocky little sandbox could become one of the most successful games of all time. Modding scenes like Arma 2's were creating experiences bigger than the base games themselves. Gamers were hungry for worlds that felt raw, experimental, and player-driven. And here comes Early Access saying, hey, if you like mods, indie experiments, and weird projects that might never have gotten funding otherwise, we've got a whole marketplace for you. At first, the system felt like a win-win. Developers got money to keep working without starving. Players got to play cool, unfinished projects and feel like insiders. The platform even gave small studios marketing exposure they'd never have been able to afford. Some of the early poster children included Kerbal Space Program, Prison Architect, and Don't Starve. These games were buggy, sure, but people loved being part of the process. Updates rolled out constantly, communities buzzed with excitement, and everyone felt like they were part of something new. But from the very beginning, there was also a catch. The fine print on every Early Access game page made it clear: these games may never be finished. Content could change drastically. You're paying for what exists now, not necessarily what's promised later. It was essentially a buyer beware disclaimer, but in practice, few people took it seriously. When you're being told you're helping shape the next Minecraft or the next Skyrim, it's easy to ignore the warnings. And when you're watching developers post roadmaps and live streams and progress updates, it feels like accountability is built in. Still, the cracks were there. The model relied heavily on trust. You had to believe that developers would keep their word, finish the project, and not just pocket the money. But trust in gaming has always been fragile. For every honest, hardworking studio, there are opportunists ready to exploit hype. And in an unregulated system like Early Access, there was nothing to stop them. That's where the problems began. It didn't take long before developers realized that the promise of a game could be more valuable than the game itself. A flashy trailer, a few early builds, and a big community could generate millions, all before delivering anything close to a finished product. Players weren't just buying games anymore. They were buying ideas, visions, and promises. and promises don't always get delivered. By late 2013, forums were already full of debates. Was early access empowering creativity or enabling scams? Was it a bold new way to fund games, or just a clever method of shifting all the risk from developers to players? One Steam user summed it up perfectly. Early access is like paying to beta test someone else's dream. Yet despite the criticism, the model only grew. Part of that was because some studios really did use it the way Valve intended. Prison Architect launched in early access in 2012 and spent 3 years being updated before releasing in 2015. Polished, successful, and exactly the kind of poster child Valve wanted. Players felt vindicated. Look, it worked. But then came the bigger, flashier projects. The ones that weren't just quirky indie experiments, but massive, ambitious titles pulling in millions. Games like DayZ, Rust, and eventually Star Citizen would define the narrative around early access. And not necessarily in a good way. Because once big money entered the picture, early access stopped being just a community-driven partnership. It started looking a lot like an endless pre-order system, where developers could rake in cash up front without ever having to guarantee results. The scam wasn't fully visible yet in 2013, but the seeds had been planted. The moment Steam told players, "This game may never be finished, but you can buy it anyway," it gave studios a business model that could run forever. And as we'll see with the next wave of titles, some of them did just that. If early access had a golden child, it was DayZ. To really understand why, we need to go back to its origin, not as a standalone game, but as a mod. In 2012, a developer named Dean Rocket Hall created a mod for Arma 2, Bohemia Interactive's military simulator. Arma 2 was already known for being dense, complex, and borderline unapproachable for casual players. But with the DayZ mod, Hall stripped it down and transformed it into something brutal, raw, and compelling. A zombie survival sandbox where every decision could mean life or death. It wasn't polished. It wasn't easy. It barely even worked half the time. But that was the magic. DayZ was unpredictable in a way most games weren't. You could spend hours scavenging for supplies, only to die in seconds, because another player ambushed you. Trust was rare. Betrayal was common. Every encounter had weight. The mod blew up almost overnight. YouTube and Twitch were just starting to define gaming culture, and DayZ became perfect content fuel. Streamers showcased tense, unscripted encounters that looked more cinematic than anything scripted in LI games. Clips of betrayals, shootouts, and desperate alliances spread like wildfire. Suddenly, Arma 2, a game that had been out for 3 years, surged to the top of Steam's charts purely because of one fan-made mod. For Bohemia Interactive, this was a lightning strike moment. They quickly brought Rocket Hall on board and announced they were turning DayZ into a standalone title. And in December 2013, right at the dawn of Steam Early Access, DayZ Standalone was released. The response? Insane. The game sold over 1 million copies in its first month, despite being buggy, incomplete, and more of a proof of concept than a finished product. Players didn't care. They wanted in on the phenomenon. They wanted to be part of the chaos. But here's the thing. The hype came with expectations. Players weren't just buying what existed. They were buying into what they thought was coming. Bohemia teased features like base building, vehicles, deeper survival mechanics, and larger, more polished worlds. Roadmaps were floated, promises were made. The game would evolve into something incredible. All it needed was time. And then, the waiting began. For years, DayZ lingered in early access. Updates came slowly, often breaking as much as they fixed. Features promised early on were delayed indefinitely or reworked beyond recognition. The infamous DayZ engine rewrite became a running joke in the community. While players begged for stability and core survival mechanics, development seemed to stall. By 2015, forums were already full of frustration. Where is the game we were promised? The community fractured. Some hardcore fans defended the process, saying Bohemia was a small studio doing their best. Others accused them of milking the hype and cashing out early. Dean Hall himself left the project in 2014, stepping down after only a year of development. To many, this felt like abandonment. The visionary who started it all had walked away, leaving behind a half-finished dream. Meanwhile, other games started stealing DayZ's thunder. Survival sandboxes were everywhere. Rust, Ark, Survival Evolved, H1Z1. Each new title promised to fix the issues DayZ couldn't, and players jumped ship in droves. What was once a revolution began to feel like just another broken promise. By the time DayZ finally hit its full release in December 2018, 5 years after entering early access, the gaming landscape had moved on. Battle Royale had taken over. Fortnite and PUBG ruled the survival shooter genre. And while DayZ still had a dedicated fan base, it no longer felt like the future of gaming. Instead, it stood as a symbol of what early access could become: endless delays, unmet promises, and the slow decay of community trust. But here's the wild part. Financially, DayZ was a massive success. Even with its flaws, it sold millions of copies. Bohemia made their money back many times over. In a purely business sense, the early access gamble had worked. Players paid upfront for an unfinished product, development limped along for years, and the studio still walked away profitable. That's when the scam side of early access started to click for a lot of people. Because if you can make millions without ever delivering what you promised, where's the incentive to finish? Why push for polish when hype sells better than reality? DayZ was both proof of concept and cautionary tale. Proof that early access could generate enormous revenue and communities around raw, unpolished ideas. And a warning that giving developers all the money up front often meant slow progress, fading ambition, and years of frustration for players. In hindsight, DayZ was the blueprint. It showed just how much hype and potential could sell. It also showed how fragile trust was. And while some fans still defend it today as a unique, unforgiving survival experience, many others see it as the moment when early access stopped being a revolution and started looking like a long con. But DayZ was only the beginning, because right on its heels came another survival giant, one that embraced early access fully, leaned into its endless updates, and built a community that was both devoted and divided. A game that proved the beta forever problem wasn't going away anytime soon. That game was Rust. If DayZ was the messy pioneer of early access survival gaming, then Rust was the franchise that cemented the model, both the promise and the problem. Developed by Facepunch Studios, best known at the time for Gary's Mod, Rust entered early access in December 2013, right in the middle of DayZ's hype cycle. On the surface, it looked like a clone. Zombies, survival mechanics, scavenging, PvP tension, all of it screamed DayZ 2.0. And that was intentional. Creator Gary Newman admitted the game began as a way to tap into the same magic that was fueling Bohemia's standalone experiment. But here's the twist. Unlike DayZ, which kept stumbling over its own promises, Rust embraced chaos. Facepunch was brutally upfront about what the game was and what it wasn't. From day one, Gary Newman said the project would change constantly. And change it did. The early version of Rust had zombies, radiation zones, and a kind of scrappy post-apocalyptic vibe. But within a year, the devs tore all of that out. The zombies? Gone. The entire map? Rebuilt. The mechanics? Rewritten. Instead of chasing DayZ's grim zombie sandbox, Rust transformed into a brutal, open-ended multiplayer survival sim, where the biggest threat wasn't undead hordes. It was other players. This was the beginning of what would become Rust's defining identity, a game in perpetual transformation. Unlike DayZ, where progress felt stuck in the mud, Rust's updates came fast and often. Weapons were added, then removed. Systems were overhauled. Entire art styles were swapped. Players would log off 1 month and come back to something that felt like an entirely different game. For some, this was thrilling. Rust never stagnated. It was alive, unpredictable, and evolving right before your eyes. But for others, it was maddening. Just when you'd figure out how to survive, an update would wipe the slate clean. Just when you thought the game had a direction, it pivoted into something new. There was no stability, no finish line, no sense of closure. It was early access as a lifestyle, a never-ending beta, and that was the genius of it. Facepunch realized something many other studios hadn't yet. Hype is renewable. Every time they dropped a major update or overhaul, the gaming press covered it. Streamers jumped back in. Player counts surged. Instead of building to one big release day, Rust thrived on an endless cycle of reinvention. Even the infamous server wipes became part of the culture. Every so often, Facepunch would reset the servers entirely, erasing player progress. For most games, this would be a death sentence, but for Rust, it was content. Wipes gave everyone a fresh start, sparking new rivalries, alliances, and betrayals. Streamers milked it for dramatic storylines. Communities treated each wipe like a new season. It turned instability into a feature. Financially, the strategy worked. By 2014, Rust had already sold over 1 million copies in early access. Updates kept the money flowing, and the constant buzz meant the game never truly left the spotlight. While DayZ was sinking under accusations of abandonment, Rust was thriving on its perpetual identity crisis. But here's the darker side. The success of Rust showed the industry that a game didn't need to ever be finished to be profitable. As long as you kept dropping updates, you could keep selling hope. Players stopped expecting closure and started accepting the grind. And once that expectation shifted, the early access model itself shifted with it. In theory, early access was supposed to be a stepping stone, a temporary phase until a game was complete. But Rust proved that early access could be the destination. It normalized the idea of a forever beta, where unfinished wasn't a problem. It was the business model. For players, this meant a constant push and pull. On one hand, the unpredictability kept things fresh. On the other, it bred frustration. People who had been there since the zombie days felt betrayed when entire systems vanished. Newcomers found it overwhelming to jump into a game that seemed to reinvent itself every few months. And the lack of a clear end state made some question whether they were supporting a vision or just funding an endless cycle. And then came the community dynamics. If DayZ was known for paranoia and betrayal, Rust took that formula and amplified it to 11. The game quickly developed a reputation for being one of the most toxic online experiences around. Griefing, raiding, harassment. It was all part of the package. In some ways, the unfinished, chaotic nature of early access only amplified the brutality. There were no guardrails, no balance passes, no polished systems to soften the edges. It was raw, messy, and often cruel. But ironically, that was what kept people coming back. Rust wasn't about stability, it was about stories. The betrayals, the clan wars, the base raids at 3 a.m., these moments became legends. And like DayZ, they were perfect for streaming. Content creators thrived on the chaos, turning Rust into one of the most watched games on Twitch during major updates. Years later, in 2018, Facepunch finally slapped a 1.0 label on Rust and called it released. But let's be real, that milestone didn't change much. The game kept evolving, updating, and wiping as if nothing had happened. In many ways, the release was just a formality, a marketing beat in a cycle that had no real end. The legacy of Rust isn't just its gameplay, it's the precedent it set. It showed developers they could release something half-baked, overhaul it indefinitely, and still make millions. It showed players they would tolerate, even embrace, games that were never really finished. And it blurred the line between development and live service in a way that we still see across the industry today. If DayZ revealed the cracks in early access, Rust widened them. It proved that the business model didn't need an endpoint. And that realization would pave the way for the most infamous early access story of them all. A game so ambitious, so profitable, and so controversial that it would define the entire conversation about scams in gaming. That game, of course, was Star Citizen. When people talk about early access gone wrong, one name towers above the rest: Star Citizen. It isn't just a game, it's a phenomenon, a controversy, and to some, the greatest con in gaming history. The story begins in 2012 when industry veteran Chris Roberts, creator of the beloved Wing Commander series, announced a new project. His pitch was bold: the most ambitious space sim ever built. Star Citizen would have everything: immense galaxies to explore, trading, combat, mining, piracy, realistic ship systems, massive multiplayer battles. It wasn't just a game. It was supposed to be a universe. And here's the kicker: Roberts didn't go to a publisher. He went to the fans. Through Kickstarter and direct crowdfunding, Star Citizen raised an astonishing $2 million in its first month. For 2012, that was huge, but it didn't stop there. Roberts and his team at Cloud Imperium Games kept the crowdfunding campaign open. Year after year, they pulled in more money. Ships were sold before the game existed. Concept art became cash machines. Pledges snowballed into hundreds of millions. Fast forward to today. Star Citizen has raised over $700 million from fans, making it the most crowdfunded project of all time. And yet, more than a decade later, the game still doesn't exist in any finished form. Sure, there's a playable alpha client. Players can log in, walk around gorgeous spaceports, and sometimes fly their ships in massive but buggy environments. But the promised universe? The living, breathing galaxy where you could seamlessly move from planet to planet, ship to ship, role to role. It remains more dream than reality. Meanwhile, the money keeps rolling in. Every year, Cloud Imperium Games holds sales events where they release new ships. Not ships in the game, but ships in concept art form. Players spend hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars to own vessels that don't even exist in the playable build. Some packages have gone for $1,000 to $2,000, offering fleets of virtual ships in a game that isn't finished. For fans, this is faith. They see Star Citizen as the ultimate passion project, an unprecedented effort to create the greatest space sim ever. They point to updates, tech demos, and new features as proof that progress is happening. To them, the money isn't wasted. It's an investment in a future masterpiece. For critics, it's the smoking gun. They argue that Roberts and Cloud Imperium are running a perpetual hype machine, promising more than they can ever deliver. They point out the endless delays, the scope creep, where new features keep being added instead of finishing the old ones, and the lack of a concrete release date. Some have called it a Ponzi scheme with spaceships. And then there's the split personality of the project itself. Alongside Star Citizen, Roberts announced a single-player campaign called Squadron 42, starring Hollywood actors like Mark Hamill, Gillian Anderson, and Gary Oldman. That game was originally supposed to launch in 2014, then 2016, then 2020. As of today, it still doesn't have a release date. Cloud Imperium insists it's in development, but fans have heard that line for over a decade. The sheer scale of the controversy has made Star Citizen more than just a game. It's a cultural touchstone for discussions about early access, crowdfunding, and accountability in gaming. Every time a new delay is announced or another ship sale breaks records, the debate reignites. Is this visionary ambition or the biggest scam the industry has ever seen? And here's what makes it fascinating. Both sides might be right. On one hand, Cloud Imperium has undeniably built incredible tech. The scale of what they've already shown, planets you can land on seamlessly, detailed ships with working interiors, massive multiplayer battles, is impressive. Few studios have ever attempted something this ambitious. If they succeed, Star Citizen could redefine gaming. On the other hand, the business model is undeniable. The company has been funded not by delivering a finished product, but by constantly selling the dream of one. And as long as that dream keeps making money, what incentive is there to ever stop? If Star Citizen actually launched and disappointed, the illusion would shatter. But as long as it stays in alpha, the dream remains alive. This dynamic, endless funding, endless promises, endless waiting, is what makes Star Citizen the poster child for the early access scam. Because it isn't just about one game, it's about the precedent it set. Before Star Citizen, crowdfunding a game for $1 to $5 million seemed like a big deal. After Star Citizen, developers realized they could fundraise indefinitely. They didn't need publishers, they didn't need deadlines, they just needed hype, community loyalty, and enough concept art to keep the money flowing. The ripple effect was massive. Other space sims popped up trying to capture some of the same magic. Live service titles adopted similar strategies, selling cosmetics and battle passes for content that hadn't shipped yet. Even AAA studios began using phrases like live development and early builds as excuses for broken launches. Star Citizen may never release in the way people imagine, but its influence is everywhere. And yet, despite all the criticism, people still defend it. Star Citizen has one of the most devoted fan communities in gaming. Players argue that critics don't understand the vision, that building a game this ambitious simply takes time. They point out that traditional publishers would never fund something like this, and that only through crowdfunding could Roberts and his team even attempt it. In their eyes, Star Citizen isn't a scam. It's the future of gaming, just delayed. Maybe they're right. Maybe one day, Star Citizen will deliver everything it promised and silence the critics. But until that day comes, the project remains the ultimate case study in how early access and crowdfunding blurred the line between dream and deception. Because here's the truth. Whether you believe in it or not, Star Citizen proved that you can make hundreds of millions of dollars selling a game that doesn't exist yet. And once that door was opened, the industry would never close it again. After everything we've seen with DayZ or Rust, and especially Star Citizen, a simple question keeps coming up. Why? Why do players keep falling for early access promises, knowing full well they might never get what they paid for? Why does this model still work when so many examples have ended in disappointment? The answer lies in psychology. Game developers might be coding systems, maps, and AI, but what they're really selling in early access is hope. And hope, it turns out, is one of the most powerful currencies in gaming. For a lot of players, part of the appeal of early access is bragging rights, being there first, being the guy who says, I was playing Rust before it blew up, or I was in Star Citizen before they even had planets. Gamers love being part of history, and early access taps into that perfectly. This is the FOMO effect, fear of missing out. If you don't buy in early, you might miss the chance to shape the game, grab exclusive content, or be remembered as one of the pioneers. It's not about what the game is today, but what it could be tomorrow. And if you wait, you might lose that chance. Gamers are natural dreamers. Most of us grew up imagining what the perfect game would look like. Maybe you wanted the realism of a military sim mixed with the freedom of a sandbox, or the exploration of No Man's Sky mixed with the combat of Halo. Early access sells directly to that nostalgia. It doesn't sell the product you can play today. It sells the dream of the game you've always wanted. This is why people defend projects like Star Citizen so fiercely. They're not just protecting a purchase, they're protecting a dream. If you've waited 10 years for the ultimate space sim, you're not just a consumer anymore. You're emotionally invested. To admit it's a scam would mean admitting you've been fooled, and that's harder than just doubling down. One of the cleverest parts of early access is how it frames players not as customers, but as collaborators. When Valve launched the program, they emphasized feedback, community, and shaping the final product together. This creates the illusion of partnership. Players feel like they're on the dev team, like their voice matters. Forums, Discord servers, and developer Q&As all feed into this sense of connection. Developers use terms like backers instead of buyers, reinforcing the idea that you're part of something bigger. It's parasocial marketing at its finest. The developer isn't some faceless corporation. They're Rocket Dean Hall or Gary Newman or Chris Roberts. You're not just buying their game, you're supporting them. And once you see yourself as part of the journey, you'll forgive delays, bugs, and setbacks. Because hey, development is hard, right? Early access thrives on the dopamine rush of updates. Every patch is a little hit of excitement. What's new? What's fixed? What's broken in a hilarious new way? It's the same loop as live service games and battle passes. Keep players checking in, keep them hooked. With Rust, wipes became cultural events. With Star Citizen, every new ship sale felt like a sneak peek at the future. Even if the core game wasn't there, the constant drip feed of content kept players engaged. And just like gambling, it's addictive. Players stay because they're chasing the next big update that will finally make everything click, even if that update never comes. Another overlooked factor is community identity. Once you're in an early access game, you're part of a tribe. You bond with other players, swap stories, argue about features, and defend your game against outsiders. Critics who call Star Citizen a scam, to the fans, they're not just skeptics. They're attacking your community, your identity. And so, people dig in deeper. They defend the project not because it's perfect, but because it's theirs. In psychology, this is called sunk cost fallacy. The more time, money, and emotional energy you've invested, the harder it is to walk away. Instead, you rationalize. You tell yourself the delays are worth it. The bugs will be fixed. The vision will come true. Because admitting you wasted your time, that's unbearable. Let's not underestimate the marketing side. Early access developers know exactly how to sell. Scarcity, limited edition ships in Star Citizen, exclusive founder packs in survival games. If you don't buy now, you might never get the chance. Community milestones, fundraising goals that unlock new features, creating a sense of collective achievement, transparency theater, weekly devlogs, live streams, and roadmaps that look transparent, but are vague enough to avoid accountability. These tactics aren't unique to gaming. They're the same strategies used by Kickstarter campaigns, NFT projects, and even old-fashioned door-to-door salesmen. Promise the world, deliver just enough to keep people hooked, and always hint that the real payoff is coming soon. At the core of it all is hope. Gamers don't want to believe they've been scammed. They want to believe they're supporting visionaries. They want to believe the dream game is just around the corner. And sometimes it actually works. Games like Hades and Baldur's Gate 3 really did deliver masterpieces out of early access. That sliver of possibility, that maybe your early access game will be the next one to make history, is enough to keep people buying in. It's the same mentality behind lotteries and casinos. You know the odds are bad, but someone has to win, right? That's why early access keeps pulling people in. It's not just about the games. It's about the psychology of hope, identity, and belonging. Developers figured out how to monetize not just gameplay, but dreams. But eventually, dreams clash with reality. And that's where the cracks start to show. The same psychology that keeps players buying in is also what makes the backlash so explosive when things fall apart. And as early access grew, those cracks became impossible to ignore. Because the problem wasn't just individual games anymore, it was the entire system. Early access started as a noble experiment. Let players fund the games they wanted, let developers cut out the middlemen, and everyone wins. But by the mid-2000s teens, the cracks weren't just cracks anymore. They were gaping holes. What was meant to be a revolution quickly spiraled into a system ripe for abuse. The problem boiled down to one word: accountability. Or rather, the lack of it. When you buy a finished game, there's a clear contract between you and the developer. You give them money, they give you a product. It may have bugs, it may not be perfect, but at least it exists. With early access, that contract gets fuzzy. Developers don't have to deliver on promises immediately, or ever. Instead, you're buying into a promise of progress. And promises, unlike finished games, are easy to stretch indefinitely. That's why so many early access titles fell into the same pattern: endless alpha, endless beta, endless excuses. Take DayZ. After its explosive 2013 launch, it took 5 years for the game to leave early access. 5 years of waiting, of roadmaps being pushed back, of fans slowly losing faith. By the time it hit full release in 2018, the hype had evaporated, and the genre it helped create had already moved on. Or Rust. The game was technically released in 2018, but that label meant very little. It was just another step in an endless cycle of updates, wipes, and reinventions. Players who bought in expecting a finished game realized there might never be a finished version. Just an evolving service that changed shape whenever the developers decided. And then, of course, Star Citizen. If DayZ was frustrating and Rust was chaotic, Star Citizen was something else entirely. A business model built on staying unfinished. Every year, the game gets flashier demos, new ships, and ambitious promises. Every year, the finish line gets pushed back. And every year, millions more dollars flow in. The accountability problem was obvious. What's stopping a developer from staying in early access forever? The short answer is nothing. Steam doesn't enforce deadlines. Kickstarter doesn't require refunds if projects fail. And fans, hooked by hope and sunk costs, often keep supporting long after reason says they shouldn't. This lack of oversight gave rise to another issue: scope creep. Because when developers are being paid not for finishing a product, but for keeping hype alive, the easiest way to do that is to keep promising more. That's why so many early access games ballooned out of control. Star Citizen started as a simple spiritual successor to Wing Commander and ballooned into the universe. DayZ promised survival horror and got lost in engine rewrites and feature overhauls. Even smaller projects often collapsed under their own ambition, piling on new mechanics instead of polishing what was already there. The result? Games that never stabilized, never hit the finish line, and left players feeling like guinea pigs in a science experiment that had no end date. Another huge issue was how early access normalized broken releases. Before 2013, launching a game in a buggy, half-finished state was seen as embarrassing, something that could tank a studio's reputation. After early access, it became not just acceptable, but expected. Players were told, "Of course it's buggy, it's early access." That excuse became a shield, and once it was normalized, it didn't take long for AAA publishers to copy the move. Look at games like Anthem, Fallout 76, or Cyberpunk 2077. None of them were technically early access, but they launched broken with promises to be fixed later. Sound familiar? That mindset was born from the early access era. And then there's the human side, player burnout. Supporting a game for years while waiting for it to get good takes a toll. Communities splinter, old players leave, new players arrive with different expectations. Forums turn toxic. Developers promise transparency but drown in backlash. The relationship between devs and players becomes a tug-of-war between patience and betrayal. Dean Hall, creator of DayZ, famously admitted he never intended to be stuck developing the game for years. He left in 2014, saying he couldn't carry the weight of expectation anymore. His departure was a turning point, proof that even the most passionate creators can't always survive the grind of endless early access. And yet, even as these problems piled up, the money didn't stop flowing. Because for every disaster story, there were just enough success stories to keep the dream alive. Hades went from early access to Game of the Year. Baldur's Gate 3 launched in 2023 as one of the most polished RPGs ever made, after years of community-driven development. These rare victories became the exceptions that justified the rule. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The failures weren't bugs in the system. They were the system. Early access wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. It shifted all the risk onto the players and all the reward onto the developers. It allowed studios to make millions without ever shipping a product. And it created a culture where hype, promises, and dreams became more valuable than finished games. In other words, the scam wasn't that a few developers ran off with money. The scam was systemic. It was the entire business model. And once the industry saw how profitable it was, there was no going back. By the time the dust settled on the first wave of early access hits and misses, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a quirky new way to fund indie projects. Early access had fundamentally reshaped the way the industry thought about releasing games, and the ripple effects are still being felt today. At its core, early access normalized the idea that a game could be unfinished and still sell millions. Before 2013, that concept would have been absurd. Launching a broken buggy product was a career killer. After 2013, it became a business model. For indie developers, early access was a lifeline. Studios with no publisher connections could now drop a prototype on Steam, grab attention, and build a community while funding ongoing development. In theory, this democratized the industry. Suddenly, the next big hit could come from a two-person team in a basement. And sometimes, it did. Games like Slay the Spire, Dead Cells, and Hades proved the model could produce masterpieces. These titles thrived on player feedback, using early access as an extended beta to polish mechanics until they were razor sharp. Without early access, some of these games might never have existed at all. But for every success, there were dozens of failures, projects abandoned mid-development, studios that ran out of money or motivation, games that pivoted so many times they became unrecognizable. On Steam today, you can scroll through graveyards of early access titles that never made it out of alpha, their last updates dating back 5 or 6 years. For every Hades, there's The Stomping Land, a hyped Dino survival game that took players' money, fizzled out, and quietly disappeared. This uneven track record left players jaded. Buying into early access became a gamble, and in many cases, the odds weren't in your favor. But the bigger shift happened when 8AA publishers started copying the playbook. They didn't call their games early access, of course, but they embraced the mindset. Look at No Man's Sky in 2016. It wasn't technically early access, but it might as well have been. Hello Games released an unfinished product, promised updates, and slowly worked their way to something resembling the original vision. Fallout 76, Anthem, Battlefield 2042, all launched broken, with developers openly saying they'd fix it later. That's early access logic in action. And then there's the rise of live service games. Titles like Destiny, Fortnite, and Call of Duty. Warzone aren't marketed as unfinished, but they operate on the same principle. Launch first, build later. Players are sold a foundation and the promise of endless updates. Roadmaps replace release dates. Hype cycles replace endings. It's the early access mentality. Only now, it's mainstream. The irony? Early access was supposed to empower small studios against the big publishers. Instead, it taught those publishers a new way to squeeze more money out of players while delivering less upfront. Early access also dovetailed with the explosion of new monetization strategies. Microtransactions, battle passes, DLC roadmaps, they all fit neatly into a model where games are never truly done. Why sell a complete product when you can sell a platform that generates revenue indefinitely? That's the philosophy behind Fortnite seasons, Call of Duty's yearly cycles, and yes, Star Citizen's endless ship sales. The industry realized that unfinished sells better than finished because finished means closure. Unfinished means infinite hype. The biggest casualty in all of this wasn't money, it was trust. Players used to believe that when you bought a game, you were getting the best version the developer could deliver. Now, every launch is suspect, every trailer is scrutinized, every roadmap is taken with a grain of salt. The phrase, "wait for the patch," has become a meme, because we all know too many games are shipped half-baked. Early access created a culture where excuses became standard. Bugs? Of course, it's early access. Missing features? Don't worry, they're on the roadmap. Disasters at launch? The devs will fix it eventually. That mindset bled into the entire industry, giving cover to both indie failures and AAA disasters. And the kicker? Despite all the backlash, players keep buying in, because the dream of the perfect game never dies. For every community burned by a broken promise, there's another ready to believe the next one. So where does that leave us? Early access is no longer new or experimental. It's just part of gaming now. Steam still has hundreds of titles in early access at any given moment. Some will become classics. Most will fade away. But the model isn't going anywhere. If anything, it's evolved. Crowdfunding merged with live service, creating an ecosystem where games can exist in a half-finished state indefinitely, as long as they keep generating revenue. And the line between scam and innovation is blurrier than ever. For developers, early access can be both salvation and temptation. It provides funding, freedom, and direct player feedback. But it also removes the pressure to finish, rewards hype over delivery, and makes it far too easy to cash in without accountability. For players, it's a gamble. Sometimes you get a Baldur's Gate 3. Sometimes you get an empty shell that's abandoned after a year. The trick is that you never really know which one you're buying until it's too late. And for the industry as a whole, early access left a permanent scar. It redefined our expectations of what a release means. It blurred the line between beta testing and full-priced products. And it set the stage for a world where games are no longer events with clear beginnings and endings. They're ongoing services, forever in progress. In short, early access didn't just change how games are funded. It changed how games are made, marketed, and consumed. And whether you see that as progress or exploitation depends on where you're standing. So here we are, more than a decade after Steam launched the Early Access program. What began as a clever way to help indie developers fund their dreams has become one of the most divisive chapters in gaming history. Depending on who you ask, early access is either the best thing that's ever happened to players or the biggest scam the industry has ever pulled. And maybe, just maybe, both are true. On one hand, early access gave us some of the greatest games of the modern era. Hades, Slay the Spire, Baldur's Gate 3. These are masterpieces that wouldn't exist without the model. They're proof that when used responsibly, early access can create a direct connection between developers and players that results in something extraordinary. But on the other hand, it also gave us DayZ's endless delays, Rust's perpetual identity crisis, and Star Citizen's billion-dollar dream machine. It gave us graveyards of abandoned projects, broken promises, and players left holding receipts for games that never truly arrived. That's the scam. Not in the cartoonish sense of a con artist running off with a bag of cash, but in the systemic sense, a business model designed to profit on potential rather than results, a model that shifts all the risk onto players and rewards developers for hype rather than delivery. And the cruelest part? It works because we want it to. Gamers are dreamers. We're always chasing the perfect game, the one that will combine everything we love into a single experience. Early access taps into that desire, selling us visions of what could be, even if what we get today is a buggy, broken mess. We keep buying in because we don't want to miss out, because we want to believe, because sometimes, just sometimes, the dream does come true. But for every dream realized, there are a dozen that never materialize. For every success story, there are players left burned, jaded, and less trusting than before. And that erosion of trust is the real legacy of early access. It's not just about unfinished indie titles anymore. It's about the way the entire industry has adopted the mindset. AAA publishers now ship games half done, confident they can fix them later. Live service titles launch as bare-bones frameworks, promising roadmaps and updates down the line. The excuse of "it's still in development" has become permanent, and gamers have been trained to accept it. Think about that for a second. 10-15 years ago, a broken launch could kill a game. Now, it's just another Tuesday. We don't even blink when a $70 title ships with missing features, crashes, and performance issues. We just wait for the patch. That's not a bug in the system. That is the system. And early access is the reason it exists. So was early access a scam? In some ways, yes. It sold us on a revolution. But what we got was something messier, more exploitative, and far more profitable for developers than players. It trained us to accept less for more, to gamble on promises instead of demanding results. But in another way, it wasn't a scam at all. It was just business. Developers saw an opportunity, players lined up to pay, and the system evolved exactly the way the market demanded. If there's a scam here, it's not one pulled by a few shady studios. It's the collective scam we all played on ourselves, believing we could buy dreams without consequences. And maybe that's the final uncomfortable truth. Early access didn't ruin gaming. Gamers did. We enabled it. We kept buying the hype, kept defending delays, kept funding billion-dollar alphas because we wanted to believe. Developers only sold what we were willing to pay for. The real scam isn't early access. The real scam is hope and our endless willingness to spend money chasing it. So the next time you see a flashy trailer for the next ultimate survival game or most ambitious space sim ever made, remember this story. Remember DayZ or Rust, Star Citizen, and the graveyard of abandoned promises. Ask yourself, are you paying for a game? Or are you paying for the idea of a game? Because in the end, that's the question early access left us with. Was it the future of gaming, or was it the industry's most brilliant con?